Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you're doing very well today. Let's pick up the Stragglers, shall we? Let's take a look at the cards from Kaldheim that people have wondered whether they will rock, and I have not yet covered that. Now, I'll spoil it at the beginning. I don't really think any of these are going to rock, but a lot of them are close. A lot of them I think are testable, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did okay as a one of. An example of that is Cheville, Bane of Monsters. I don't think that card really rocks in that I don't think it's going to be the part of any optimized shell anytime soon, but it's a fine one of. People have put up results with Cheville as a fine one of. Maybe some of these cards fit that bill too. Even if they don't, or, whether or not I'm estimating them correctly, some of these cards may also be ones we want to file away for the future, even if they're not great or perfect for our needs right now. Certain synergies could be printed to, enable them in certain ways, or the meta could shift with bans and unbans. So you guys know that mid-range players must always be consulting a repository of maybe board cards in order to next level the meta. So that is why we like to cover these spoilers thoroughly. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you very much to all patrons. Let's begin. First up, we have Skemfar Elderhall, a mono-green ETB tap land. 4. 2 gray, 2 black, 1 green, and tapping the Elderhall, and sacrificing the Elderhall, so this is a monstrous activation cost. Again, it's a total of 6 mana, plus you have to sacrifice the land. Up to 1 target creature you don't control gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Create 2 1/1 green elf warrior creature tokens. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So, let's get that out of the way. Let's repeat that. The activation cost is massive, and there is a significant tension between only really being able to cleanly kill X1s and X2s, and not being able to do so until turn 6 at the very earliest in the absence of ramp. So that right there is a big red flag, but I don't want to say it's a total deal breaker, because honestly, mid-range decks always need to play some number of utility lands, and insofar as utility lands go, conceptually, this is right along the plan with Rock. You are using this to develop your mana to make plays in the early game, even though it's inefficient because it's mono green and ETB tapped. And then in the late game, the ceiling is you get to kill something and you get to make 2 bodies. That's kind of a lot. That's a lot of value. That's a serious X for 1 when you are on a mid-range deck and when it all lines up. But in terms of the sheer power, again, there is a significant tension between the huge activation cost and the fact that it is only killing weenies. And if you look at this land that's able to kill -2/-2, kill creatures with a -2/-2 effect, there's already a card like that exists in Modern that sees basically no rock play. And obviously it's not a direct apples to apples here, but if near Deadlands, it is going to stymie your mana development in a different way. It is mono black instead of mono green. Frankly, mono black is better. And it ETBs untapped, which means it does not cost you any tempo. And the only downside with its mana production, other than being mono black, is you do have to pay 1 life to add black to your mana pool every time. And of course, as the nurturing peatland owners know, that will add up, right? But you don't even always have to do that. You can make gray mana painlessly as well. And then If Near Deadlands is essentially going to be 1 mana cheaper at being that removal spell on a land. You don't get the Elf Warriors, but in the context of a mid-range deck, the Elf Warriors are a bit win more, are they not? This is kind of what I mean about future synergies. Right now, Rock doesn't have a ton of ways to, really leverage or really cash in these 1/1 elf tokens for some kind of serious value. You could picture something like Vraska Golgari Queen cashing them in for value, but that's very Winmore, and Vraska's not really a core card anymore. Never has been, honestly. And, a deck like Jund maybe can go wider, or an Absent Stoneblade deck can equip them, but these are definitely just, hard to justify, whether it be the mono black If Near Deadlands, or in the case of what we're talking about, the Elf Warriors. what's the name of the card I'm covering again? Skemfar Elderhall. These decks just cannot afford a mono green ETB tap land where Rock can, so it's a little less synergistic in Rock, a little more playable in Rock. Ultimately, I think if Near Deadland's not really making a splash in Modern, I don't really expect Skemfar Elderhall to as well. Before we get off of the subject, I wanted Cabal Pit in Modern Horizons 1. Possible we could get this cycle in MH2. It's definitely a pretty cool one. And this is a true, cheap, efficient trade your land for the death of a weenie effect. It is gated by threshold. The land production is even more gated by damage. The mana production, rather, even more gated by damage or life loss than if Near Deadlands. So you see how these effects kind of exist on a spectrum. Skemfar Elderhall is probably the highest ceiling, and actually in a couple interesting ways the highest floor, but just activating that ability is not that realistic. Sadly, I would expect this is more likely to see play in a ramp deck, in the usual suspects, you know the decks that play a million lands and there are a bunch of utility lands and they can even tutor the lands in various ways and they can mitigate the downsides and they can easily achieve that activation cost. So this could be tutorable removal in some kind of Primeval Titan shell. That is unfortunately a little bit of a better fit. If this was just a little bit cheaper, if it was even 1 gray mana cheaper, I would be much more hyped about it. And here's the other thing. Again, it is right along the plan. So, let's say in Rock you want to play, or you do traditionally play, a Treetop Village. It is pretty hard to justify a mono-green ETB tap land in more than one slot, if you ask me, because we have such pressure to play, such high copies of Field of Ruin and Ghost Quarter, and we need to make our mana work otherwise for casting our spells, right? But let's say that Treetop Village is a card that you currently run, and let's also say conceptually you think that creature lands have lost their way a little bit as a great thing in Modern, but it's still kind of worth a slot to you. Maybe that's where you could test Skemfar Elderhall. So to sum up, it is along the mid-range plan. It is a very powerful effect. It is pretty much guaranteed X for 1, but I don't know if it is realistically going to be a factor in almost any normal Rock game. Now, part of that same land cycle is Great Hall of Starnheim, and I think this one is a little bit more straightforward to evaluate. It is part of the same cycle, so it's also a mono-colored ETB tap land with an activation cost that requires also to tap and sacrifice the land itself. In this case, it is a mono-black land. Hey, it might be easier to fit ETB tap land that's monocolor in your main color rather than with your splash color. Depends on other things, but I think in general that's a fine principle to assume. And then the activated ability is for white, white, black, and tap and sack, create a 4/4 white, and you have to sacrifice a creature you control as well. So that's a very lengthy activation cost, and the ability is create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance, once again gated by sorcery speed. And the home for this, again, more straightforward, more obvious. This goes into a Dead Guy Ale deck with a healthy amount of lingering souls. This does a lot for Dead Guy. Number one, if you look at Dead Guy lists lately, they do play a high density of utility lands. It looks like it's too high to me. We're seeing like people play 3 Shambling Vents a lot of the time and 3 Silent Clearing, and to me that's probably one too many of both of those, right? But Great Hall is operating on a different dimension, you know. Again, Shambling Vent, just like Treetop Village in the previous segment, if you're starting to call into question, you know, the real efficacy of the creature lands or the man lands, maybe Great Hall replaces one of them relatively easily. By the same token, you know, there is definitely such a thing as too many pain lands. Great Hall, although it will slow you down tempo-wise, does operate painlessly once it gets to untap. And the notorious weakness of Dead Guy Ale is that the creatures are all weenies. You have Bobs, you have Tide Hollow Scullers, you have Stoneforge Mystics, and of course you have the army in a can of Lingering Souls. But Lingering Souls is the very best candidate for this, although if a Tide Hollow Sculler is just a bear against a Hellbent opponent, or if Bob is getting a little bit too out of control, those are other good candidates to be turned into an angel to ascend to the divine after passing through the Great Hall of Starnheim. But of course, the idea here would be, in a grindy game, you get your 4-for-1 with Lingering Souls, and then with one of your lands that helped you cast all of that stuff, you upgrade one of the souls into a 4-4 flyer vigilant beater. So, Great Hall of Starnheim, definitely, I think, a testable one of in Dead Gael. Not going to revolutionize the archetype, but a solid role player. If you're heavy on the Lingering Souls, it looks to me. And now, my friends, we must go in search of greatness. This is an enchantment for 2 green. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may cast a permanent spell from your hand with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the highest converted mana cost among other permanents you control without paying its mana cost. If you don't, scry 1. So, let's go over that again just so it's clear. It's easy to miss 1 or 2 things in this box of text. This will happen at the beginning of your upkeep, so before you draw, which is relevant for the analysis, you get to cast a spell for free. That spell has to be equal to 1 plus the highest converted mana cost among other permanents you control. So, In Search of Greatness does not see itself, it does not count itself. And you have to have something that fits the criteria. You have to have another permanent on the field that survives, and you also have to have another permanent in hand that is equal to 1 plus. So this is along the lines of, Pod and these other, go up the ladder of CMC type things that we have seen before. This is a very powerful card, especially because it has that final line of text. If you don't, scry 1. That might as well read, if you can't, scry 1, because most of the time, corner cases accepted, you will want to avail yourself of this search for greatness style effect, but if you don't, you still get to scry 1, and let's start our analysis there. That is actually very interesting. Mid-range decks, mono green, if you want to consider this in other decks as well, doesn't traditionally have card selection. Certainly does not have that direct scry effect that is at all playable in Modern. There are ways to achieve pseudo-scry, like with Mishra's Bauble plus Fetch Land, but getting to literally scry 1 every turn as the floor, that's actually pretty good. So I'm ultimately going to conclude that this card doesn't rock, and I'll go into why, but let the record state that if I'm wrong and if I underestimate it, and or if it just sees play in other decks, which I think it probably will, a lot of that will have to do with that floor of scrying 1 every turn, which not only is good value in and of itself, not worth a card and 2 mana, but it's a decent enough floor for the fail rate, it is also going to help set up and search for greatness itself. The scry feeds into the other abilities. But where do the other abilities, which really are the major strength of the card, fit into Rock? Well, they don't all that well. The big draw to Rock, and the big draw to BGX midrange in general, is the low curve, the efficiency, the card quality relative to casting cost, because we don't cheat on mana. We don't play Ether Vial, we don't play Mana Dorks, we don't ramp things out, we don't play like the Amulet package with bounce lands and Amulet of Vigor and so on and so forth. We don't play rituals, we don't play anything, basically, that allows us to cheat on mana. We kind of have a pseudo-cheat on mana when we are just casting really efficient things like a 5/6 or 6/7 Tarmogoyf for 1 gray and 1 green. That is how the BGX mid-range decks operate. If you look at In Search for Greatness, you want to play more like a Collected Company style curve, or maybe like a standard format mid-range style curve, where you are playing all the way along the curve up to 3, 4, and 5, and you are having lots of draw effects baked into the cake. Now, Rock has some pseudo draw effects or some unconventional draw effects like Dark Confidant, but we're not playing a ton of cards that say draw a card. And in Search for Greatness wants you to keep your hand full all the time. That's how you really abuse it. That's how you really use it to cheat on mana, use it to get all this value going, use it to overwhelm the opponent's board state. So it does a lot. It's a very interesting design. It's probably going to be pretty impactful on the format in at least one shell, I would have to imagine. We'll see exactly where it goes. It's nice for us BGX players. We have a lot of main deck ways to answer an enchantment, and it doesn't draw a card when it enters, so it does actually for once reward you for playing Abrupt Decay and similar style effects, right? So I don't think it will rock because, again, the rock curve and the rock lack of draw a card tribal is definitely two strikes in terms of where Search wants to slot. Having said that, again, the Scry is interesting. If the card proves to be underrated by the community, it's just kind of busted in half, and all and sundry are playing it. Rock could probably be one of those, but ultimately, I think other shells are where this will really thrive. Next up, let's take a quick look at some of the members of Kaldheim's Black Pantheon. We have Tergrid, God of Fright. She's an expensive one. She is a MDFC, though. We have 3 gray and 2 black, CMC 5, Legendary God, a 4/5 menace. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. This card would rock if it was cheaper, and if it was proportionately toned down with the stats or whatever. I'm thinking significantly toned down, and also like a 2-drop, so you could resolve that, and then resolve your Liliana on turn 3, because this is the Liliana of the Veil synergy card. Liliana's tick down, opponent sacrifices a permanent, Tergrid can buy it back. Ditto if Lily ticks up and they have anything besides a land to pitch to that +1. So this is the Liliana synergy card, but it is pretty much win more, because if you're getting all the way to turn 5 or 6, 7, however long it takes you to make your 5th land drop, and you're still activating Liliana, you're in a good spot anyway. Let's get it clear. So yes, you can then X for 1 your opponent with this Tergrid static ability, and she's also a 4/5 menace, which is very, very respectable as a finisher. Ultimately, just too clunky, just too big. And that is real tough, because you can see the Kaldheim, the divinity of Kaldheim, they want attrition, they want depletion, they want interaction, they want fair black-based mid-range, but the other gods, the titans of nature's wrath and the gods of R&D are, tempering that wish. But let's take a look at the backside. Let's take a look at Tergrid's Lantern. It would be really cool, again, if this was cheaper, just because we'd be looking at something that you could at least, more often than not, plan to play out early, and then on the occasions that you top deck it with an active Lily in the late game, then you get to play the front half and it would be amazing. But Tergrid's Lantern, again, it is just such a tease because it's just so expensive. You got 3 gray and 1 black for a 4 mana legendary artifact, and it is pretty good. Again, it is very synergistic with the deck. We are having we have a couple lines of text here. The activated ability is simply tap, no other cost. So the turn you play it, you can tap it. Target player, so stopped by Veil of Summer, stopped by hexproof effects. Leyline of Sanctity is probably the biggest offender here. Target player loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. Once again, the synergy with the Rock Plan is huge, and for that matter, the synergy with each other is huge. So if you have multiple Tergrids in your deck, you can play the Lantern on turn 4, and then you could play the God on turn 5 if you had 2 copies in hand. Again, this is not something that's modern viable, though, just because it is so slow. If you have the luxury of going whatever, discard into Goyf, into Lily, into Lantern, into the God, that'd be great. That's just not going to happen almost ever. And again, if you are doing those things, you're probably in a good position with other cards, even if they're not top-end hyper-synergistic bombs. The other ability of Tergrid's Lantern is actually pretty good too. It's expensive. For 3 gray and 1 black, you get to untap it, so you can, kind of solo your opponent with Tergrid's Lantern. This is a Punisher effect. The opponent will take the least damaging option. And the only way I could really see making a case for these cards in Modern is if you plan to play Kill Everything Tribal. Like, you're just not going to put early pressure on, you're just going to really interact as heavily as possible, and then land these cards and run away with the game with Liliana plus the Tergrid Lantern or the Tergrid front half or both. Here's the problem. The Punisher effect of the Lantern, which is the more realistically castable and leverageable half of this card, they're just going to take 3 life a bunch of the time because you don't have that pressure. Again, if everything lines up, you're going to be doing fine, but you'd be doing fine anyway with the more important things like discard, Goy for pressure, Liliana on curve lining up. So again, this is cool design. It is such a tease because it is so powerful and so synergistic, but so far away, in my opinion, from being Modern viable. This other mono-black god is a little more reasonably costed, though. What is up with Egon, God of Death? Well, Egon is 2 gray and 1 black for a legendary god with Death Touch and a 6/6 stat line, so right away you're like, okay, well, that's big. That's a lot. I like it already, but read on and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile 2 cards from your graveyard. If you can't, sacrifice Egon and draw a card. Now, this is definitely a very interesting fit in decks that, as a matter of course, fill their graveyard up a lot. On the Rock, do we really fill our graveyard up a lot? I would not say so. You compare, when I'm saying a lot, I'm thinking of like maybe Rakdos midrange fills it up more aggressively, having a higher density of proactive interaction like Lightning Bolt as opposed to holding up like a Decay or a Pulse in hand that you will with green. And, they trade more aggressively early on. There are more looting effects. None of that is true in Rock. Also think of like the old-fashioned Grixis Death Shadow decks that are filling up their graveyards with Thought Scour to enable Delve. That's what I mean, and I'm not even getting into the territory of like Satyr Wayfinder, Grizzly Salvage, those types of cards, right? The self-mill effects. If we're just looking at mid-range decks that, as a matter of course, fill the graveyard, Rock is kind of in the middle of that spectrum. It fills it up more than white decks do, but less than the decks I just covered. So, Egon, can you realistically leverage this card? I think you kind of need to test it to see. It is a very high ceiling. 6/6 Death Touch for 3. And you also, if you can't pay the cost to keep him around, you sacrifice him and then draw a card. It's really not that bad. The thing is, I just don't know if this really solves any problem that we have on the Rock. It's a beater, the 6/6 and the Death Touch is nice, but ultimately those two things are a little win more. Death Touch is not especially synergistic with a gigantic stat line, right? Most other common abilities you see on creatures would be more welcome than that. That said, I wouldn't really blame anybody for testing this card. It's definitely very cool. It definitely does a lot. And again, the floor is not that low, because if you can't fulfill the cost, or if they're hating it out with Rest in Peace or whatever, you still have a very clunky cantrip, but there is also a back half too. What does the back half do? Well, this is really cool, simply because it is a mono-black 1-drop artifact. You do not see that every day. It is called Throne of Death, and at the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card. That is the static ability. So, just as we saw with the previous god, with Egon and his Throne, you can play multiple copies. They do synergize with one another if you play the back half, the artifact half first, followed later in the game by a subsequent copy deployed as the front side. So that's all cool, but ultimately this is probably a consideration for a format other than Modern, right? Are we realistically displacing a ton of Rock cards with this stuff? I don't think so. But Throne of Death has another activated ability for 2 gray, 1 black, and tap the throne, exile a creature card from your graveyard, draw a card. Honestly, that's pretty good too. So these cards do a lot, but with Rock, I don't quite think it is going to rock simply because we don't quite get enough value out of that self-mill. I think if you look at a shell like Rakdos midrange, however, this could be a pretty cool one-of. Rakdos seems to get a lot of value out of that self-mill, given the presence of Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger, given the presence of Seasoned Pyromancer. These are like directly synergistic cards that you actively want in your graveyard, right? And they're a Kolaghan's command deck, so maybe in the case of Spyro or of other threats, they even have good targets to buy back. If you think about the self-mill in Rock, it's more like nebulous. Like, it generally can grow the Goyf, it generally could provide a Skooz target, but then Throne of Death's activated ability works at cross purposes to that, because you are exiling creature card from your graveyard to draw a card. So with Rakdos, I feel you will be able to have your options if you have a graveyard full. With Rock, it's more like you're not necessarily getting that much benefit out of the self-mill, because the best thing this does in Rock is that activated ability, exiling the card, draw a card. And I understand that the static ability feeds the activated ability, but it is all a little bit too slow. I'm not certain that it is worth a card, but as a 1-mana legendary artifact with some really unique abilities, it might honestly be worth trying, again, because you have that front half of Egon, God of Death. So again, is this a card that solves any of mid-range's problems? I don't necessarily think so, but it is unique, it is powerful, it is very, very flexible, and I think ultimately Rakdos midrange is probably the most hopeful shell from among the traditional midrange archetypes. Let's now take a brief look at Draugr Necromancer for 3 gray and 1 black. It is a snow creature, a zombie cleric, a super cool card with a lot of text, and it is also a 4/4 for 4, so not the worst. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile that card with an ice counter on it instead. Okay, fair enough. Reading on, you may cast spells from among cards in exile your opponent's own, with ice counters on them. And you may spend mana from snow sources, though, or mana from any color to cast those spells. Mana of any color, rather. So basically, there is a replacement effect where instead of the creature dying, it gets exiled. Let's focus on that. Number one, it's a little bit win more, because if your removal spells are lining up on Rock or Jund or any of these other black-based mid-range decks, you're probably doing okay anyway. That said, it is very unique to have a replacement effect that exiles things, and notoriously BG and BGR, Rock and Jund, cannot exile things profitably. You have to, put 2 different effects together, like a kill spell plus a Nile Spellbomb activation, to really achieve that exile effect. Draugr Necromancer, in a way, does it more cleanly, but in practice, that's not really true, because he's a 4-drop without any protection effects or anything like that. Nevertheless, an exile clause, very, very interesting. Although, even that is not strictly better than killing things, because, of course, things in the graveyard can grow Goyf, feed Skooz, etc. The second half of the ability is card advantage. So, just like the other cards that we've been looking at, it is along the plan with Rock and with other decks. You can cast the spells that Draugr Necromancer exiles with ice counters, and you may spend mana from snow sources as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. Couple problems here. Number one, Rock is not a deck that facilitates a ton of snow mana. Obviously, we could switch all of our basics to snow, and we might be able to sneak another snowland or 2 in there. More on that in the final segment of this video, but ultimately, I don't think we really have the incentives. You are not wanting to sacrifice the powerful non-snow utility lands just to get more snow effects, just to build around a very marginal card like this. Now, if we had a Rock equivalent, in our colors along our plan of Icefang Quattle, for example, that might be a different story. Draugr Necromancer is slow, is win more, unfortunately is not very viable. Another tease, simply because these are really interestingly designed cards with really unique effects that synergize directly with our mid-range plan. They are just simply not efficient and powerful and broken and high floor enough, because none of them draw a card, right, to really displace things in Modern. But this is definitely one I wanted to quickly mention, because this trend that I commented on throughout this video does show that this type of design is still kicking around in the heads of R&D. It's just not getting pushed as hard, apparently, as some of the more fire-oriented cards. But it is still out there, and maybe we'll get a break on a card like this that really rewards us for playing a heavily interactive and removal-based game one of these sets. Final card to briefly mention, which will be firmly filed away in the maybe board for later section of your collection, or your digital collection, or even just your memory, is Woodland Chasm. It is the Golgari Snowland, and of course there's a whole cycle, so whatever mid-range colors you play, you can add those here. And by the way, the cycle is gorgeous. They remind me of the Cold Snap lands, which I was a huge fan of, the Cold Snap duels, just in terms of the naming convention, the flavor text, the art. I love them so much, and Woodland Chasm and the Kaldheim common cycle is no exception. And it's just a bad land for our purposes right now because we don't need snow, and it's just going to ETB tapped, but it's a powerful, powerful land simply because it is snow, and it is fetchable. That is why this cycle is powerful. Unfortunately, this might spell bad news for us. I mentioned Icefang Quattle in the previous section. That card's really good against the rock, and you might see an uptick in play of that, for example, on the strength of some of these. Quattle fell off hard without Astrolabe in the format, but these snow duels are an enabler. The reason I mentioned them in this Will It Rock video is because there are snow effects that might one day be necessary or high value enough for us to play. We just covered Draugr Necromancer. If it was more powerful, we would need to build around it with snow effects. You have a card like Dead of Winter. A lot of these things are close, and you never know what will be printed in the future. So just remember that Woodland Chasm exists. If we need to replace some other lands with this to enable snow effects, even at the loss of tempo, we now can do it, whereas before it was probably a bit of a pipe dream, probably pretty unrealistic. We would have to load up on too many basic lands more than is good for us without reconstituting the spells of the deck as a whole. But Woodland Chasm, a bit more of a free roll. Don't play it yet. There's also a little bit of snow hate coming out in Kaldheim. You don't want to walk into that for no reason, but maybe in the future we'll want to reach for this one. Well, there you go, friends. A lot of ground to cover. I went on for longer than I intended. Part of me wanted to make this really brief, really snappy, but then the other part of me says, no, talk more, talk for longer. What's the point of making just a 1-minute segment on each video? You must elaborate. So this is the internal struggle that I always have, but I know a lot of you guys are used to that by now. The long-form content without flashy visuals. My voice just kind of disembodied, and hopefully I'm not talking to myself. Hopefully you're hearing me, you're with me, and if you agree, let me know. If you disagree, I want even more for you to let me know. If you think any of these cards, you have a stronger case for them, the comment section is the place to let us all know. So thank you so much for watching. Again, if you have anything else you're curious about with the new set, please do let me know. You can ask me about that. You can ask the community about that. Thanks for watching gameplay. More gameplay coming soon. I'm cranking out the content as much as I can. I'm trying to revamp the channel so it is more fun, more sustainable, more freewheeling, and also showing a wider variety of content, but we will always be filtering everything through what is the mid-range take on this. No matter what we do, that's still going to be my home base. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you for the next video.